Welcome to episode 127 of the Homelab show. How you doing, Jay?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. Now, this is kind of going to be a broad topic. It may not be a really long topic, and we're not going to just focus on games, although we will wander into that topic for sure on
Oh yeah.
emulation. I think this is a good thing to cover. It's popular for the home lab because people go, where do I get started in a home lab? And this is one of those things. And we talked about retro home labs. We've had on Veronica before, and we've talked about that. But I also think it's just important to talk about the emulation side. She collects a lot of the old hardware. Not everyone has the space, or as my problem is, I will become too obsessed if I get too much old hardware, and then I end up with an entire display case like Jay has of classic things. I like
Right.
emulating and going through it because it provides a good basis of learning, though, to emulate some of these things. So that's our topic for today.
That is our topic for today. That is right.
Um, I do want to make a quick announcement, and I'll actually start. Jay's video is getting close to being done. His new series of things.
Yep.
I'll
The
pitch that right there.
LPI Linux Essentials course. It's taking a little longer because I'm a bit of a perfectionist. It was supposed to be done on the 1st, and here it is on the 8th. But it's moving pretty quick. I really don't think it's going to survive the week. I think I said that last time, but
Yeah.
omit
Well,
that.
and
Uh,
Jay's pulling the typical developer move. It'll be done when it's done.
right.
It will be done when
It,
it works properly and it's right. And there's a
yep.
level of perfection going into it. So definitely important there. Next,
I can say some things that I know I didn't know last time, like 23 videos total. I didn't know that last time.
mm,
I don't think so. There's 23 videos total. So the scope also increased a little bit because I added a few things in there. So that's also part of the reason. So yeah, just can't wait for it to come out. And that's also I would have a more interactive topic for us today, but of course I'm in course mode. So we'll talk about
yeah,
emulation. We want to have some fun and just talk about something that's really cool, something that was in our wheelhouse. So we chose emulation.
yeah. And I'll also give a shout out if you haven't checked out Jay's new swag store. He introduced me to a new company, and I've been looking for a new company for swag. So Jay had his swag store at first, so he's got some new merch in there to check out, and he's added some more since his launch. And today, I officially made live my new swag store, which is basically the same company on the back end that Jay's using. So the quality is a lot better, and the hopefully the experience is a lot better because we both of us were previously using companies that we were less than thrilled with, which it's fuzzy because we're using Teespring.
I was.
Yeah. Teespring is become like many of these other companies, like a bunch of other companies conglomerated together. So they went and tried to go the route the cheapest, and that's not always the best route. I prefer quality, and so do most people. If you want to buy a shirt, you're like, I'd like the print to last. So we
We
both
don't always do a great
yeah.
job marketing. Where's your store actually located? What's the URL?
Oh, the URL for mine. I made mine easy because one, you can find it from lawrencesystems.com. Jay embedded his right in his site because he's smarter than me, and I'll get there. And but you can go to lawrence.video/swag. That's where I have mine on there. We don't have a sponsor today, so we're just promoting ourselves. So
Yep.
check out our channels, like and subscribe. Buy our swag, please.
Well, basically, yeah. I mean, we say that, but it's funny because we sometimes we create these things and we don't do a great job of always letting people know. At least I don't. So it's like when I updated the store, I don't even think I mentioned it a single time on this podcast, like not even one time. But I probably wouldn't have if you didn't. So merch.learnlinux.tv. Since you mentioned it, I guess I will too. So
Yeah.
there's our I guess is self-sponsorship
It's
segment.
self-sponsorship. We're making it. It's I guess it's self-promotion. We'll do a little bit of
Something.
that here before we dive into the topic. Jay also has a cool T-Mux. I need to order one. He's got a cool T-Mux mouse pad too. If you can't remember those T-Mux shortcuts, he has a whole video series on it so you can learn T-Mux. But if it didn't stick, get the mouse pad.
Yep, it must be. And desk mat will be coming at some point with BIM
Yeah,
and Tmux on either side of the keyboard.
yeah. I see people asking about better pricing to shipping to the EU. We
Yeah.
lack a lot of control over that. I don't know if there was a separate EU store that had an option. Cool. I don't know though. That's a little, I will ask. I will ask around to see if there's a better way to do it, but I'm not sure. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
It,
So
it's one of the things that sucks about the whole thing because if it was up to me, nobody would pay shipping for anything. I mean, let's be fair. I mean, I would rather nobody ever pay shipping, but part of the whole process is, excuse me, the company is taking over, the logistics of the products for us because we're making videos. But unfortunately, that also increases the cost a little bit too with the shipping because I think that's kind of how they do it. So unfortunately, that does seem to punish other countries, but if there's any way to lower the shipping, we'll always look into that
Yeah,
for
we'll always do
sure.
what we can if someone has some suggestion around it, or just you want to reach out to me and Jay, feedback at the homelab.show. We have a couple things that we seen coming to feedback. We'll do a feedback episode at some point where we kind of pour through some comments and things like that. But today, let's get started on emulation.
Let's get started.
Oh, I am holding my Retroid emulator.
Nice.
I think you got one of these too, didn't you? The
I do, but I have yet to even use it a single time. I turned it on once, but then I got sidetracked, of course, as I often do. So it's on my desk somewhere, but I'll definitely get to it. I'm looking forward to it because it has a really good hardware. It's the what do they call those joysticks? The
yeah,
Hall effect, I believe.
yeah, wall effect magnetic ones. I specifically the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. I got no affiliate links. We're not at all sponsored or affiliated with them.
Okay.
Me and Jay just happen
Yeah,
to buy them.
nothing.
I've been replaying, reliving the retro dreams on it because it's portable and easy. And what I like about these is when you have a dedicated device, I mute my other devices so I don't have distractions, and that includes this device now. It doesn't have any distractions. I just play what I want to play, and the world doesn't exist for a little while. And I kind of like that.
I
So you
think
get
there's an added bonus having these around. I know it's like, what do you guys do? Play video games all day or make videos? Actually, both, because when a video's rendering, I mean, what are you going to do? Stare at a progress bar or play some Super Mario World? I'd rather do the latter personally.
Mario World. I just went
Definitely.
through all of it again, beat all the Star Worlds. But let's start at the beginning here. One of the reasons I think the emulators are so important is I really not everyone had the opportunity to play with some of the Commodore 64s or Tandy computers back in the day. But I think emulating them, one, for those of you that maybe had a little bit of curiosity or were able to touch one of these, which by the way, because some of them are collector's items, buying them in the flesh, real hardware is can be pretty pricey. They go for quite a bit. I was at the Retro Midwest, the Midwest Retro Computing Fest. Yeah, I think that's what it's called. There's a few different retro computing events that go around the US here, but there is a it's crazy what some of the things go for, but there are free and online where you don't have to download anything. They work in your web browser abilities to emulate many of these things now. And I think it gives you one, the nostalgia of touching some of the old ones, maybe spark that up again if you're someone who maybe worked a little bit with it, or if you're someone who's going, well, I was not born when that was popular, and I would curious what these older people with gray hair are talking about, and you want to try some of this stuff. It kind of gives you a project to focus on, and because of the simplicity, when you start looking at something, and TRS-80 was my place, the TRS-80. It taught me a lot about how peek and poke registers work. If you are, and I think a lot of the audience here is probably a listener to of uh, the Security Now podcast. He's actually used that term several times, talking about peeking and poking, talking about moving memory addresses. The nature of the emulated systems can really help you grasp the fundamentals of computers in a smaller space. When you start looking at it, you're like, oh, this is a number of a magnitude smaller than what we currently run and the architecture we have access to. So it puts you in this narrow mindset and puts these kind of walls up and restrictions that kind of put you go, all right, I can only do this many things. There's only this many registers. There's only this tiny little bit of memory. How did these things work? And it gives you some better ideas under those constraints to really get you thinking and understand
Hmm.
the fundamentals. Do I know exactly? I don't spend much time thinking about peeking and poking registers in Linux and doing that. But the reason I know how you move memory registers around is because I learned it at that small scale level where it was is an easier thing to absorb, is basically what I'm trying to say.
Right.
And it becomes a little bit approachable when you talk about running just basic in there. I mean, granted, today start with Python, but then someone always leads you down the path of something overly complicated. You could break things in assembly and get complicated with a TRS-80 or a Commodore, but if you start with some of those basic stuff, and it was so good having like the Gorilla tool, the gorillas that threw bananas as one of your first basic programs. If you remember playing that game ever, it was not a really extensive game. It's easy enough to load on there and emulate in one of these systems and then start just learning basic coding. It's not going to be a relevant language. I'm not saying this is your career path, but it can get that
Right.
curiosity and understanding. I actually think this is, tangentially related to why people like Arduinos and some of those small project kits, because it also gets you into that mindset of, here's this small device with only a few components, but I can make a light come on, I can make a light go off, I can start controlling these small movements. It's not like we handed you a sophisticated robot with a million little servos and controls. We're like, hey, just make this little thing blink. And that
Right.
basis, I think, is a good place to start with emulation. It's one of the reasons we want to bring it up to talk about it. I think it's just one of those fundamentals, not to mention the concept of emulating a processor. When you think about what they're doing and they emulate some of these 6502s and some of the other chips, you're like, wait a minute, that works how? It's
Right.
really
Right.
cool.
We have to just take a moment and just recognize a parallel. I don't know if very many people notice between the Commodore 64 and computers in a similar form factor and the Raspberry Pi 400 nowadays.
Yeah.
In the Raspberry Pi platform, just like you're saying, Arduino and all of these, you're basically drawing a parallel yourself. And I'm just saying, basically, yeah, you're more than right. I mean, look at the Pi 400. It's literally a computer you can hook up to your TV and program on, just the same as the Commodore 64 and other computers like it were. And then the platform's already a do-it-yourself platform. So I really kind of do think that maker market in the electrical engineering space is pretty much the current age equivalent of that, and it's probably you're probably spot on.
Yeah, kind of another slight tangent, but I'll leave a link in the show notes to Retro Bytes. If you're not familiar with them, it's a channel that covers a ton of that computer history as well. Kind of tangential. I think I brought them up before because they had specific videos, but just in general, it's a good YouTube channel that will walk you through a lot of this old technology. But there's this preservation, and I see people talking about, the nostalgia right away coming up in the comments for playing some of these. But there is, a reason we call it some of the best era in gaming, because right away it does go to the games. And we're going to miss some of that here with modern games, because 10, 15 years from now, as these servers shut down, unless someone really takes it upon themselves to build something online, and that is
Mhm.
always fraught with legal problems and complexities because no one necessarily had access to the server. So in some of these games that have an online component shut down, that is the end of that game. It can't be played without the online server component. This is one of the beauties of going through some of these and having all these retro games. And some of it, I believe, is all fallen into public domain. I don't quote me on that. I'm certainly not a lawyer, and I'm
Right,
certainly not your lawyer. So don't
right,
take
and
some guy said this on YouTube as legal advice. But if you do some
right.
reading and do a little Googling, you will find all kinds of things. The archive, they've determined a lot of it can be stored in the web archive as well. So it's not too hard to find some of those old ROMs and things like that.
Yeah, I think someone within our circle, I can't remember who it was. I want to say it was Chris from Craft Computing mentioned this, and I couldn't get it out of my head since. He said basically the last original floppy disk will die within our lifetime. And I just thought about that for a minute because that pretty much tells you everything you'll need to know about preservation and or my opinion on it, because that's one of the things that I think emulation gives us. For example, I brought up the Pi 400 some time ago. I think before I increased the quality of the YouTube channel, so warning. I did a video on the Pi 400 where it was emulating old DOS games. And the project was one of the most fun that I've worked on because I literally sourced the physical copies of all these PC games. I had the box, the manual, the CD, everything. I went on eBay. I spent a lot of money on this. Some of these were going for like over $100 for a used copy, but I wanted the authentic experience combined with I was still going to emulate it, so then I had to rip ISO images of each, and then I had ISO images ripped off of each one. But while I was doing it, I realized as I'm taking copies of these floppy disks and these CDs, I'm going to be preserving these. So my investment, even though there might be disk rot or something like that, I still have the copies. And then with ZFS, I can make sure they're properly scrubbed, and I don't have to lose those. So it helps me especially protect these because I don't know in 10 years if I put a CD in and it'll still work. There's still a debate on disk rot, whether it's a real thing or not. I don't know, but I'm not taking a risk. Take an ISO image. And then, we start to see a parallel between Homelab and this because the two together can basically benefit, especially as we're taking backup copies of software that we used to run that we want to preserve.
Yeah, and I seen someone say there's people preserving some of the old stuff. I mean, Usagi Electric's channel, I'm guilty. I watched a lot of that. That's
Yep.
watching him restore some of that old stuff is great. There's definitely a lot of people in the preservation of it, but Jay's very correct here about the floppy dying in our lifetime, and it's CDs too. A lot of the burnt CDs,
Yeah.
because of the chemical makeup of them, especially the first gen ones, they didn't last, and that's been on my to do list, is to convert some of the old CDs I have that I burned, and is there anything worth preserving on them? What is, what isn't, and just archiving a lot of that stuff. The reality is, it's funny because they're not that big anymore. You're like, oh, they
Right.
hold. Oh, that's it. You first, you're like, man, I remember this is a lot of my storage, and you're like, oh wait, I can put all of these on one drive now. By the way, don't put them on one drive. Put them on a spinning ZFS array that has error checking and regular scrubs, so you can ensure your
Yep.
data lasts a long time.
And I think, the moral of this is that at Homelab, we also just solve problems like these with clever solutions, because my video game collection, as big as it is, a certain percentage of it is disc-based games, and I want those preserved. I don't know which ones may or may not get hit by disk rot. Someone in our chat room said that it's a very real thing, but not all discs die that way. I think that sounds correct to me. So, but I'm still not taking that risk, right? So I'm just gonna make sure I have backup copies of things, not because, and this is I guess the point I'm making is that there's this stigma that anyone who uses emulation is a freeloader. That can be true, but correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because somebody might be wanting to be a freeloader or could be one doesn't mean they are. Sometimes we just want to protect our investments, especially now when you have cloud companies taking our movies away from us.
Yeah.
Um, Making copies of discs, this is something that I think is going to repeatedly come up over time, and I don't think this is a topic that's ever going to go away. And even when it does, it's going to come back, and we're going to say, okay, we really need to take care of this. But emulation is what gives us the ability to enjoy our backup copies. So it's one thing to take the backup copies, restore them, but the emulation layer, if our original computer goes bad, we can still enjoy the software. One thing that I know from Veronica is that with Commodore 64, it could be kind of, if you have a physical one, the floppy disk can be somewhat of a pain. You go on eBay to, buy a piece of software, it may not work. You have no guarantee that you put it in there, it's going to work. So at this point, it's already the case that with Commodore 64, you're getting to a point where some software can only be enjoyed that way, even if you do have the original hardware. So we're already seeing that emulation isn't this thing that freeloaders are just trying to get things for free all the time. It's literally a required part of preserving data for history's sake. We want um, kids, grandkids, whatever, to show them, hey, here's Oregon Trail. Wasn't this cool? Don't we want to do that? So I think when we put all of this together, the mindset and the mindset of the average home lab person, if you could call us average, I think there's a Venn diagram that opens up or overlaps, and there's definitely overlap.
Yeah, the preservation of it and the understanding of how to use it is why we're encouraging people here in 2024 to look into this, because hopefully there's someone on the younger, earlier side of their career than me that goes, hey, I'd like to get into this as well and kind of
Right.
keep it going. It's amazing to me that there's still a good community around it. And I was actually pretty happy that I went to one of the retro events. It wasn't just people my age or older. There was a good amount of younger people that are into collecting it. So I think it's been it's been a good journey myself as I dive into it. It's a good way to make a lot of friends because, boy, what you can learn is if you go to one of those events and you have a question about an Apple II, a Commodore, or a TRS-80,
Right.
you can have an hour-long conversation. It's just by, hey, why is that one a different color than the one I used to have? Let
Right.
me tell you the history of this. And it was kind of, I spent 2 days there, and I'm ecstatic to go again to the retro event because I don't know, I walked through that entire area probably a dozen times in circles, just talking to everybody. It was a lot
Oh,
of
that
fun.
would be so incredible.
Yeah,
And
it's definitely an event to go to, but I'm not here to eliminate about it being a fun event. The other concept that is will teach you is how virtualization works. Virtualization and emulation are close cousins to each other in
mhm,
concept, especially when you're talking about emulating a different chipset. This is actually what you start learning is how they provide, or you start looking at how QEMU and Proxmox and XCP&G and the Zen server hypervisor, how do they bring forth certain hardware being virtualized to an
Right.
underlying operating system? And this is why I can speak to a lot of those when I've had discussions with people. They'll talk about chipsets and things like that. They're like, wait, why does that matter? I'm like, oh, this is all learning I had from the early emulation days of getting things set up and realizing how chip emulation works, how you rebuild those registers, how you have things access those, and how the code works with it. That basis concept, then I extrapolate out because it's a lot bigger to write an entire hypervisor that emulates things for the operating system, but those same concept apply. They're just scaled out bigger.
And sometimes when you go to these shows or talk to people, it's more important than you think because my thing is I always like to have the physical copy of the software and the hardware because I just love that aspect of it. So when I wanted to get into the Commodore 64, of course, I reached out to Veronica from Veronica Explains and asked her about it because she's the expert on this.
Yes.
And rightfully so. She gave me an important piece of advice that I felt like I would have been at a very big disadvantage if I didn't know. Because you mentioned you should never use the original power cord for a Commodore 64. If you buy one used, she said, don't even consider using the original power cord. Go on Amazon and buy one. They make them now. There's companies that still produce
Yeah.
these. Something about I can't remember how she explained this, but something about this amount of time has passed, then they're not going to hold up well, and it could cause a short that could, cause your system to break, basically.
Yeah, the capacitors in them, and as you know, you've seen bad capacitors on older motherboards from a certain
Mhm.
era. The capacitance can change, and that's part of the electrical circuit and how it regulates the voltage. So if those have failed and some of the components have corroded, you may not get the exact power you're expecting out of it, which of course could
Right.
fry your old hardware.
And I put down a big amount of money on this because it had the box, the instructions, a cartridge, everything. I couldn't imagine how horrified I'd be if I go to turn it on for the first time and I break it, right? So that's why it's always important to join clubs or even online forums if you're an introvert like me, and then you can still get your information. And sometimes, and I guess I bring up the physical hardware because I think it's going to be very common when someone is wanting to turn on one of these old computers, you'll find a Raspberry Pi device or some kind of something attached to it because the original discs don't really, work anymore. The floppy disk hardware is having trouble at this point. So we're getting to a point where emulation is required, especially for that, because my understanding is, again, unless you have a certain model floppy drive for the Commodore 64, there's a problem. So they're going to use a Raspberry Pi or something equivalent. I forgot what she said they were using nowadays for this, but here we have a device emulating a floppy drive. So it's not even emulating a system; it's emulating a peripheral device to allow a real device to accept software and run it. So at this point, we're only getting started with emulation, in my opinion.
Yeah. And matter of fact, this is really interesting. And I'll probably do a video on this as a topic. We said yes to something we probably shouldn't have said yes to, but there's not many other people that know how to do this. A customer had a problem. They had a 1998 is when it was installed SCO system running a database for a
Oh
company.
boy.
Now, the part that'll blow your mind is that these drives still work and the machine is still in use today in 2024. So that is 26 years of use, 26 continuous years, and it's still on, but it's failing because it's been on for 26 years. We actually were able to get the database transferred. The final transfer is actually being done over Kermit protocol with a serial cable. But through emulation and through using Blue SCSI, we were able to get the base OS copy. And if you're not familiar with Blue SCSI is basically a card someone came up with to emulate SCSI so you can work on Apple devices because the SCSI drives were less popular, the 50 pin ones, for example. So this is a way to plug into those old ribbon cables using an SD card to emulate a old drive because you can't find these old drives in working order because they're so old, and they go for a decent amount of money at any of these used sales because, well, they were the less popular drive, and there's not an easy way to replace them with anything else. So by using all that and all the emulation knowledge that mostly that Jason Slagle has over at CWR, he was able to assemble a lot of this, and I helped a bit too, getting it plugged in and transferring database. But once again, there's even some real world I will stretch that there's some real world applications of saving or getting data off some of these old machines, but it's that back to the emulation understanding that gave us some of these fundamentals. Even though for me, it's like I started with some of the real hardware. Now I emulate the old hardware for nostalgia reasons or to replay Mario World. the It's kind of fun how there's just a good connection all the way here in 2024 for a project where we literally use those for a pretty big thing. We might do a video on it because it's just fun to talk about how that came to be, and then using debating between Z modem and then going to the Kermit and finding a compiled old C Kermit that would work on SCO. Hey, we just had the only thing we had to do was get a what do you call that? Null modem cable to get the two devices connected to get it transferred to the new server, which by the way, we've got SCO running inside of another server on a virtualization so we can actually back it up. So there's a lot of stacks of extraction.
Emulation is a tool. I mean, that's what it is. It's a tool, and a great use case is for making these things live forever. But like you're just mentioning, there's many use cases for emulation. It doesn't have to be just because I don't want to pay for something. It's because this thing I've already paid for, I want to keep it working or want to continue to enjoy my software investment, which is also important too. So
yeah, there's a lot to it, but whatever gets you going on this is why we want to bring it up as a topic. RetroArch is awesome. I will leave a couple software links. Like RetroArch is probably one of the projects you could look at. RetroPie, look that up. You've got videos on a RetroPie, don't you, Jay?
I do, but they're really old. So I need to reach out and to the developer and kind of see how the project is going, because it's a project I wanted to help out with myself because I love it that much. But I've been busy, but I need to reach out and see how they're doing. So the videos are kind of old, so I don't know for sure if they're for the most current version or not, but you could definitely check them out because I'm sure it probably hasn't changed much. But I would also say if anyone can just tell us what emulation software or hardware we should check out, I'd like to know what you guys are using, because this video is to get the discussion going. That's why we're doing this. And then we could come back and talk about, every now and then. It's not going to be the emulation podcast, but every now and then we could pick something you guys come back with. And, if it's a Homelab related topic about emulation, and maybe cover it. So that we'll get the discussion going.
Dive in this together. Jay should show off his collection sometime of all the stuff he has.
Yeah.
We'll invite Veronica on because she is just a wealth of knowledge of all the emulation stuff as well, because of her knowledge of the actual hardware. She was at the retro computing event as well, sharing in all that knowledge and things like that. So it's definitely a fun place to learn. It's accessible. It's matter of fact, this is outside of collecting the actual hardware, starting with a Raspberry Pi project and getting something like RetroPie going and all the guides that are out there for that. Absolutely. Very accessible for people who are going, what's the project I should start with? Next to nothing for budget other than I can only have access to these Raspberry Pi 3s. I'm like, how much emulation you can run on a Raspberry Pi 3? And those are being tossed out now. They're still completely relevant for things like that. And of course, if you can get a 4 or 5, you get that much more horsepower with them.
Oh yeah. I mean, imagine that kind of horsepower back when the Commodore 64 was a thing. I mean, we throw them out now, which is horrible because of landfills, but just for that reason. But we have very powerful, cheap computers compared to the what we had before. It's kind of incredible.
Yeah. PDP and VAX computers. Steve Gibson, I believe, has one of those emulated behind him. If you watch Security Now on the podcast, there's people who make the modern versions of the PDP. If you just want to watch a fun video, look up how those are programmed and how you got data into them. Because you're like, wait, where's the keyboard? Yes, that's now you understand how this works, and it's a fun learning opportunity for you to kind of roll through that and start understanding the fundamentals of technology better. All right, well, that's all we have here for emulation today. We won't be, unless Jay has a solo time to do this. I'm traveling next Wednesday, so I won't be able to make the Homelab show. We'll figure out when the next one's going to be. Please hit us up, feedback at thehomelab.show for suggestions, show topics, and things you may want covered in here. We're going to revisit some of the things, because now that we're at episode 127, we can go back. There's changes to talk about since the things we talked about before. So looking forward to hearing from all of you, and thanks.